For almost 3 years running, since the coming on board of the President Buhari's administration, the federal government has struggled to keep the economy afloat with its economic recovery and growth plan. Only recently, the Bureau of Public Enterprises released a scary report that 37% of the 140 firms privatized since 2004 are failing. Is the sale of national assets the way out of the economic doldrums, or just a quick fix? It's question time. Welcome to the program. I'm Benga Ashuru. Please join in this conversation. Send us a comment on our social media platforms. As the federal government tries to revamp the economy, all eyes is on the Bureau of Public Enterprises. How does it intend to address pressures from different quarters calling on the review of the privatized assets tagged failed enterprises? Join us in this engaging interview with the Director General of the Bureau of Public Enterprises, Mr. Alex Oko.
The Bureau of Public Enterprises actually was set up by an act of parliament in 1999, and basically it's the agency of government that's responsible for the divestment program of the federal government of Nigeria, and that implies that certain enterprises, businesses and ventures that hitherto the government had initiated and perhaps owned wholly needed to be privatized, reformed or commercialized in some way or another.
In privatizing many of these assets now, there's the workers' concern, the labor union concern that the future of the career is not taken into consideration. So how do you deal with this, many of these gray areas, litigation and workers' compensation?
What we do in that process is then to engage, the workers, to engage the unions, and make them critical stakeholders in the privatization or commercialization process. So I'll give you an example. The National Council on Privatization, which is the supreme body for taking decisions as far as, the privatization of public assets are concerned, has represented on that body the president of the Nigerian Labor Union. And also some of the other committees of the NCP. We also have various labor unions as critical stakeholders of those committees. In terms of the enterprises themselves that need to be privatized, when we set up bodies like the project delivery teams or the steering committees, we ensure that members of the labor unions are part of it. So it's not a process that is shrouded.
What's the foolproof plan that the labor unions itself, representing the public, will not get financially induced or compromised in whatever way?
Now, first, the process and how it guarantees that the interests of the workers are concerned. Now, how that works really is that we expect that the representatives of the labor unions who should be representing the interest of the workers will be able to articulate the concerns, the fears and the interest of the workers in the process of the privatization of the enterprise itself. So as members of those committees and including the council itself, they are supposed to help, refine that process of privatization by taking into consideration the critical interest of the workers. So we ensure that labor matters, workers' interests are well articulated and embedded in the privatization process, such that the outcome of that process benefits the workers. So, but beyond the workers, you also made the point about the general public, right? Who, feel a sense of common ownership, of these enterprises, the assets that are being privatized, and it's a genuine concern. So what we try to do in that process is to encourage the general public to also be a part of the privatization exercise, and we feel that the best way to do that is to take these enterprises to the stock market. Whereby, ordinary folks can buy shares as part of the privatization process in the enterprises. If you recall, companies like UBA, talking about the banking industry, First Bank. Let's come down to the downstream, oil sector. Oando, Fort Oil now. These are all enterprises that were fully owned by the federal government, previously, and were privatized through, public offers. And it gave the generality of the people, the citizens of this great nation, beyond the workers, the opportunity to then buy the shares or some of the shares of those companies. And then that gives, a sense of joint ownership and commonwealth of assets that belong to the country that are now being offered to the public. So I think that, a lot of education needs to take place so that people know that really privatization is not only to the interest of a few powerful, wealthy individuals.
The reason for embarking in this privatization exercise is to make many of these assets more commercially viable. Now we have a very scary statistics. Since 1993, we have records that 86 firms have been privatized and of no impact. They've been of no impact to the economy.
I think that, like I said, the skills to manage these enterprises on a commercial basis are not typically resident in government or in the government sector. So, and you also have to recognize the fact that, taking the risk or de-risking a particular venture, may not be something that is palatable to a core investor to go into initially. So I think that what works, the framework that will work, is that government de-risks the venture by committing its capital into the project, and subsequently, hand over, that enterprise or that project to the skills, the competencies, the capacity to raise capital for continuing improvement of those assets to the private sector, so that government can then concentrate its own resources in providing social goods, social services, schools, hospitals, and such other infrastructure.
Now, how do you feel when you hear reports of pressures from different quarters that many of the failed privatized ventures should be reviewed?
We have to be objective about this. And I'm sure some of those views have been expressed around certain, some of the utilities, especially power, to be honest. We have to be honest enough to admit that perhaps the power sector privatization could have been handled a lot better. But you see, this was a very complex transaction. You were looking at 11 distribution companies, at least between 6 to 7 generation companies, including the hydros. So for me, it is conceivable that we may not have gotten it perfectly right. But the point really is that at the point at which these companies were privatized, PHCN, its successor, its predecessor, NEPA, was really crumbling out of the fact, from the fact that government could not devote the necessary resources to continue to improve the generation infrastructure, the distribution infrastructure. So we would have gotten to a situation where the whole power sector will collapse anyway. So privatizing it was the right thing to do. Was it done perfectly 100%? I would say no. Do we have an opportunity to correct those problems?
We do.
I think that we should have handled the privatization in phases. I think that it was just such a huge project to have handled at one go. Perhaps we should have privatized the generation companies first, and then look at the transition network and then the distribution network in phases.